Welcome to episode 5 of Think Aloud. I'm Harriet Fitchlittle, an arts and culture journalist who is here to take you by the hand as we meet the people shaping arts and culture today. Today I will be less taking you by the hand and more clinging desperately onto any friendly stranger that will hold mine, because we are talking about jazz. Now, Louis Armstrong once said, if you have to ask what jazz is, you will never know. I'm hoping that the guests joining me in the studio today will be more charitable towards the uninitiated than Armstrong was. Head of the EFG London Jazz Festival, we'll be talking to Orphy Robinson, the British jazz multi-instrumentalist, who has a busy few weeks planned, as the same week that he is performing here as part of the festival, he'll also be going to the Palace to receive his MBE. Joining me on this meandering ride through the world of jazz is David Jones, who is one of the directors and programmers of the London Jazz Festival. Last year marked 25 years of the London Jazz Festival. The first one ever was held at Union Chapel in Islington in 1993 as an outgrowth of the Camden Jazz Festival. Headlined by the New Orleans Rebirth Brass Band, who are still going strong today, I believe. I have with me David Jones, who is going to be talking about the festival. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you for joining us. I mean, maybe, as I think I warned you before we started this, jazz is not my forte, and that was one of the first questions I was thinking of when I was researching this. It's this New Orleans Rebirth Brass Band, who headlined the very first ever festival, which I think you were involved in organising. Yes. They still exist.
There's still that kind of surge, isn't there, of party music, and I think in 1993 that was almost seen as something exotic, and now I think it's absolutely at the centre of what jazz is, and where jazz is going is a music that people can really enjoy and be inspired by and be excited by. So there's, that sort of spectrum that goes from having a great party to being involved in something experimental and cutting edge, and that's what we try and do with the festival.
So we can expect lots of bums and seats in terms of ticket sales, but lots of bums in the air in terms of dancing. Ineloquently put, but you're expecting a lot of dancing at the festival.
Yeah, there'll be things like that programme right across the festival, because it happens in 60 venues, and the Southbank, I suppose, is 4 or 5 of them, So for us, it's that sense of being right across London and able to draw in people who don't define themselves as being jazz fans, so we have things to offer them that they'll be attracted in by. On the last day of the festival, there's a fantastic singer from Venezuela who's working with Javier Limon, who's a kind of Mediterranean producer of film soundtracks, and Nella Rojas is based in New York, travels from Venezuela, and she's creating this special performance for the last night of the festival. First time she's ever played in Europe.
How much of your role then is as a facilitator, and how many ideas come from you?
It's a real mix. I mean, we know that
What are you most proud of? What are the ideas that you're really proud to have at this year's festival?
I think the things that I'm really happy to have inside the festival are things that really represent classic jazz and then take it in new directions. So, for example, Bill Lawrence, who's Snarky Puppy's keyboard player, working with the WDR Big Band, with a legendary arranger and conductor called Vince Mendoza leading the band, seems to me like pretty much what it's all about. It acknowledges the heritage and it takes it into new places. So that, again, is on the last night of the festival in the Queen Elizabeth Hall.
And so, with apologies to Louis Armstrong here and to all jazz fans, what unites the people who are going to see you perform in this festival? For want of a better word, I suppose what I'm trying to ask is, what is jazz? I mean, you've got everything.
I think there are 2 ideas. One of them is...
so you're ready to go. You don't even need me to finish the question. You're so prepared to be asked about the intricacies of jazz. No, I was looking at the range of the people we have performing, and it's everything from the South Korean vocalist Yunsun Na to there's a Debussy-inspired performance. There's music from the Harlem Hellfighters and World War I. It's just, there's such a diversity of sorts of music that are coming in. What unites it?
I think it's 2 things. One's spontaneity and one's improvisation. When we first started doing the festival, people were like really critical. It's like, this isn't jazz. What are you doing bringing in African music? What are you doing having these singers here? This isn't what the canon of jazz. And luckily that whole way of thinking has died out. I don't see the point of doing live music that is just repeated night after night, because the audience can always tell it's like that. So we're programming things that we think will excite tens, hundreds, thousands of people.
And you were talking then about a kind of sea change in the way people respond when you program things that are not what, you know, they consider to be proper jazz. I was watching this documentary recently, the We Out Here documentary about the young British jazz scene, and there's a young drummer in that, Femi Calioso,
Yeah.
who says that, you know, jazz has got the reputation for being elite and it's not elite. And he's right, it does have that reputation. And so I wonder if you could give us a kind of very potted history of why jazz has acquired the reputation of being inaccessible. We know it's not, let's take that as a given, but why does it have that reputation?
I don't think it does, really. I mean, I think it's always been a music that people have played in schools. It's not a music where you need like an extraordinary level of virtuosity to start it, but I think it has stood in opposition to a very kind of simplistic silo approach, you know, that says rock and roll over here, classical music over here. Jazz is the music that flows in between them all and joins them up. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter whether it's filling arenas and stadia and dance halls or whether it's something that's happening on a much smaller level. I think it's a music that people have always been able to get into.
And that's the case for kind of why it isn't really elitist, but that doesn't totally answer the question of why, you know, this young drummer says at the beginning of this documentary, this is perceived as a slightly sectioned off part of the music. Do you just disagree with that, or do you see where the perception comes from?
I wouldn't want to argue about why he says it. It must be his experience. He must have felt that at some point. But I think the fact is, I think the festival is part of the dynamite that blows that attitude wide open. I don't think it's something we've contributed to, I think people were very preoccupied maybe in the last millennium about the idea of the end of jazz, you know, that there would be a point where all the great jazz had been done. And I think what jazz has done in the last 10 years is reach out so confidently to musics like hip hop. It's taken flavourings from other music, which again you could trace back in the 50s and 60s. You could listen to John Coltrane and his fascination with Indian music, African music, the things that he worked in that were an absolutely key part of an identity for jazz. But in expressing those things, perhaps there was a time when people were using intellectual academic language around it, and that maybe presented the barrier. I don't think it's often the musicians or the way the music's played, it's the explanations. And I think very often, yeah, academics delight in creating things which are complicated, you know, so that they can then create a theory and explain the theory in great detail. And I think now there's very much a movement not to create simple music, but to make that emotional connection a very, very central part of what you do.
I'm going to ask Orphy this question as well when we talk to him, but what do you think makes, if you had to describe the sound of British jazz, or what do people associate with it?
Well, I think the international aspect is very important. It's probably the first time since the 70s that people have actually been going, there is something definably coming out of Britain, and it isn't like one group of people who play together. It's a scene, and it's very diverse, and it goes in different directions, but it's the British scene, and we want to see it in Germany, we want to see it in Italy, we want to invite it to America. So it's going back to places that are already, you know, doing a great deal of jazz, even into America, where people tend to be very unsure about jazz coming from other places, and it's seen to have an energy, and it's seen to cut across borders.
So energy, diversity, I mean, what does that boil down to in terms of sound, or is that impossible to say?
I think it's a sound of individuality, really. I mean, I think,
mysterious.
You know, I think a lot of it has come out of some form of dancing. You know, I mean, that's not to say that everything is dance floor music that's transferred somewhere else, but I can't think of very much music that I'm excited by that hasn't kind of come out of a sense of what happened on a dance floor 10 years ago. And that's taking you back to the roots of jazz. It's not like doing something to jazz that it's never experienced. If you were listening to jazz before the Second World War, you were probably dancing while you listened to it.
And that's great. So the British might get a reputation for being good dancers at last. Unless our Prime Minister has anything to do with
leading
it.
the way.
And so something you've been talking about a lot with this festival is the idea to not be, in any ways, gatekeepers to a certain sort of music or a certain sort of experience. But you have to be gatekeepers in a way because you are choosing what gets programmed and the calibre of the things on the programme. How do you go about doing that in a way that feels inclusive? Do you spend every night of the week at gigs in tiny venues trying to find the best musicians, because presumably you don't want to go just off what is kind of the established canon of good performers?
I'd say there are a lot of people at Sirius and a lot of people who are close to us. So that sense of word of mouth is very important. That draws you to things. We sometimes will think, we want to program in this direction. We'd like to look at more work. The festival has programmed, placed an emphasis on programming women as in featured ways and working with artists from the beginning of their careers. So those are kind of threads that you'll see passing through everything that we do. For example, when we worked with Orphy Robinson, we'd known him for a very long time. When he used to be in Andy Shepherd's band, and he was like playing as a sidesman effectively, and then he kind of developed his own voice, and we were kind of keeping in touch. He was supporting things that we were doing. We were going to see things that he was up to. And then he won the Jazz FM award last year, and he said, I'm doing this thing I really want to do about Astral Weeks, and we were like, we'd love to have it in the festival if you fancy doing it, because Astral Weeks was released exactly almost to the day 50 years before the concert that we're doing in the Queen Elizabeth Hall. And so he kind of, set to and did these arrangements and found ways that it wasn't just trying to reproduce what had been there, but took that inspiration and took that feeling and the emotion that courses through Astral Weeks and turned it into a great live performance, which he premiered earlier this year in the knowledge that he would be bringing it to the London Jazz Festival.
And that's something we're going to be hearing about in the interview with Orphy, which is coming up next. 50 years ago, a group of leading jazz musicians went into a New York studio with Van Morrison and produced the album that will become known as Astral Weeks. At the London Jazz Festival on the 19th of November, Orphy Robinson is bringing musicians together to recreate it. Hello, Orphy. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
If the sound quality is slightly odd today, it's because we are sat in a locker room, a dressing room at the Southbank Centre, which you said you'd been in before a couple of times.
Right. Yeah, with various different things. Even having Nigel Kennedy warming up over reggae songs and then going out to play Bach. So you know this odd corner of the Southbank Centre better than any of us. Bruce Springsteen said that Astral Weeks gave him, he said, a sense of the divine. And I know that in part that came from Van Morrison, let the musicians improvise around him. When you were thinking about how you were going to recreate this album as a live performance, how did you think about bringing that element of spontaneity into it? Are you playing it as they played it, or you mix it up a bit? So when I first came to the idea of, I'd been invited to listen to the album, and by Colin Carty, whenever we would meet, he would say, why wouldn't you be, interested in doing Astral Weeks? And I said, I didn't know you wanted me to be involved in that. He said, I'll keep asking you, but you keep giving me other people. So I was a bit slow, went away, listened to it, and then realised that because obviously I've come from a jazz background and jazz musicians were the people involved in the album, you couldn't then look at it as just a sort of straight, it's 6 of this, 8 of that, it was, they were expanding on things. And when you sort of realise and you go through the words as well, streams of consciousness and it's just flowing. So
and lots of the recordings were done very quickly, almost in the first take, weren't
first
they?
take. It captured an essence and a feeling, a spirituality as well. But everything felt, for me, 360 music. The words were driving things, and as musicians, we're used to doing that, particularly when you work with singers. All the players were tip-top session players as well as jazz musicians. There were lots of different things that I picked up that I hadn't really noticed before. I'd never really explored the album as a whole. It was interesting to really go into it and really absorb yourself into the whole sort of story and treat the words and lyrics it's poetry. It's absolutely, amazing. So that was sort of the thing that drew me in and made me think that if I choose correctly the musicians, we can bring something to this. It's not just to
replicate, because we haven't got Van Morrison in the band,
Yeah.
is to take it to somewhere else, to respect it, but also to just add something of us to that.
So in practice, that means that musicians on stage, they've got a score, or
yeah, they're open to as Van Morrison said to Connie Kay, actually, just play what you feel that works for the music. So for the musicians, it's quite easy to pick up chordal progressions, harmony, melody, all of those things, but it's also about really feeling the story of each piece and treating it with the respect that it deserves, but also bring in, again, the story. I've always thought the story in the song tells you what's acceptable.
And what will you be playing on stage?
I play vibraphone on there on some numbers, and percussion, and just directing things.
But you will then be limiting yourself to just a few of your many instruments, because, a partial list, I think, of what you play is vibraphone, marimba, keyboard, saxophone. What have I missed? Steel drums?
Steel pans.
Steel pans.
Vibraphone. I said vibraphone. Trumpet.
And how would you describe the vibraphone to someone who had not seen one? It is not a vibrating phone, which is what it sounds like it's shorthand for.
Okay, so there are different ways to describe it.
Before,
the Art Deco tea trolley, or the haunted milk float.
Okay, wow.
Okay, it's the bells. It's it brings the world. The heavens open up, and all of that thing. Heavy metal vibes and all of that. Okay, so in the family of tuned percussion, you have obviously xylophones and marimbas. A xylophone, the clue is in the word xylo, is a Greek word for wood, so it would be wooden instruments. The marimba is the lower end of that. The vibraphone is metal notes, and then with the pipes, it has the various different sizes of pipes, going up from the low notes where the pipes are bigger, and the high notes where they're smaller. But the vibra, obviously, is to do with vibrate. So we have a motor that turns, and it turns these little things inside the pipes, and it gives you your vibrations when you press a pedal, a sustain pedal. Actually, it shouldn't be called a vibraphone, it should be called a tremelophone, because it's actually a tremolo sound. But, I don't know, tremelophone is a bit of a mouthful.
Yes, that's catchy, for sure. For an already underrepresented instrument, it's not giving it its proper name.
That's right, yeah.
And we were talking a bit before we started recording about the fact you would like to learn to play the guitar.
Yeah.
Would you? You've learnt so many instruments. Mm-hmm. Are you good at not knowing what you're doing? I don't know whether it must make it harder or easier being a professional musician. How do you feel when you're in front of an entirely new instrument that you want to learn? Do you mind being terrible at it to begin with?
Oh, no. I love the idea. It's a journey. It's a journey of discovery. As to what does that do? What's this? What's that? I had, 2 years ago, I was given an accordion, but however I was banished to the shed at the end of the garden after a while. But that's incredible, because it's got obviously a sort of keyboard as we would normally recognise, but then it's got these pin things that you push in and out, and there's fourths and fifths and all of that. And I just had this whole thing of wouldn't it be great to learn a whole accordion repertoire of Bob Marley songs. I thought could be really cool. And I explore. I'm very interested in technology as well. All these new apps you can get for all the various different devices. I'm quite into all of that world and the digital world with this the Roly, which is this whole new way of playing. It's a keyboard that instead of your usual sort of set notes, you can go in between them, so you can really bend things around, and you can send sounds to space and all sorts of things. But you can also, you're limited only in your imagination as to programming things as well, and creating your own sound world, really. I've always been the nosy kid,
So you're clearly very good at keeping up with, technology, what's happening in the jazz world. What is happening in the younger British jazz scene at the moment? Is this a boom time, as I think it's often been, articles come out referring to it as such recently, or is there only particular sorts of jazz that are getting airtime? How do you see the current landscape for teenagers, people in their early 20s?
It's a good time because it kind of reminds me of the 80s when I came through in my generation. That term jazz is such a wide umbrella of sound, and as you know, within jazz there are lots of different genres, but we were fusing, say, sort of modern jazz and the standards and various different things with things like reggae and funk and soul and R&B and all of those things. So we were creating a whole new sound world, and there was a whole generation of young people coming through from a Caribbean background as well that engaged with the music, and because we were not really invited into the establishments where you were being taught music and jazz, we created our own. We had a background of coming from soul and funk and reggae and military music and all sorts of things that we then, as you develop on the instruments more and you get more technically proficient, you seek out music that also marries the two. And jazz, for me, playing the vibraphone and playing the marimba and all these things was the natural progression for the instrument. And of course, people were signed to the huge labels, and I myself was fortunate to sign to Blue Note, which is the legendary jazz label and all of that side of things. So you then travelled the world, and then you found out that people actually knew about musicians who were here, knew about bands that you never thought they would know about, and all of that really opened the door. And then the door closed again, but a lot of the musicians became session musicians, so they then influenced other musics and other bands, and bands that do very well. You would see all these musicians coming through. Jazz was always there and has continued, and there's been fantastic musicians, but the spotlight wasn't on them after that. It just kind of quietened down a bit, and it went back to a kind of like there were the enthusiasts and the specialists and the guys with the beards and the goatees and all of that. But now what's happened is new audiences are coming back in again. There's new audiences who would say, I don't like jazz, but I like this. And we go, well, we're playing jazz. And they go, I didn't know this was jazz. So you'd get a lot of that as well. And that influenced new musicians coming through and then musicians started to morph into teachers and ended up into these institutions where we were not really a part of previously. Funnily enough, this year has been the first year where there's been probably half a dozen teachers who've come from my background, who are in the institutions. Most of us worked within community groups. And from those community projects and things have come lots of musicians who have gone off to do, they might be doing rock, they might be doing pop, they might be doing jazz, or whatever. We had a lot of musicians coming through and a lot of vocalists as well who have gone on to do all sorts of things. They're in bands like, they play for Ed Sheeran, they play for Rudimental, they play for all these different groups, because I didn't force jazz down their throat. It was just music appreciation.
So a good time to be a young jazz musician.
Very good.
But you've also spoken critically about certain trends within the younger jazz scene of, what did you refer to as kind of cabaret singers or cabaret style?
Yeah,
what would that mean?
Yeah, we did have that, I would say 10 years ago. I used to call it the invasion of the cabaret singers. Obviously the centre of London in particular. But that became the big thing of, being pushed. And it really wasn't the jazz, because there was a lot of music going on that was much more interesting than just recreating music from the 1920s. So for quite a few of us, we were looking at some fantastic singers being literally forced to do a particular thing that they didn't really want to do. But to push that area of music above all the other incredible things that were happening in improvised music in particular, the scene in the UK is absolutely fantastic, with the London Improvisers Orchestra and the various different venues like the Cafe Oto and the Vortex, and you go to the festivals abroad and you see a lot of English musicians who are not being pushed here.
What do you think it would be like to be a musician learning their trade now with access to the internet? Better or worse?
There are ups and downs. There are upsides and downsides. I mean, one is that the instant access to information and to audiences and just to a whole market that was really difficult to get to before, because you had to go through record companies and you had to have your stuff in the record shops. It cost a lot of money, and those deals were not really around for everyone. And to get your music in the shops was really something. If you didn't have that help, and also just to have it on display, it's okay getting it in the shop, but if nobody knows it's actually there, promotion, marketing, all of those things. The youngsters now, or whoever, can embrace so many different things by going on the internet to invite audiences and people to listen to you. The things that you can put up, you've got the best site for me, which is Bandcamp, that you go direct to the artist rather than going through streaming services that the artist doesn't really see anything. I mean, it's in the word streaming, they stream all the money away. So you will put something out and it'll have 50 million plays and you get 10 quid. The sales that you would have in, say, the 1970s, 80s, 90s are never going to happen again. You can get to number one, I suppose, in a pop chart now on sort of selling 5 figures or something, whereas you wouldn't have even scraped the top 200 at that time. But you can create your own audience, you can promote your own gigs, you can, live stream your gig, your rehearsal, your practice to people watching. With Astral Weeks, we put up online maybe 3 minutes of a rehearsal. As we were going through a rehearsal, we live streamed, and the venue involved that we were going to play in then sold out. So
it's easy to find even relatively niche audiences and bring them together.
Yeah.
And just coming back to Astral Weeks then, what kind of audience do you expect to have for a gig like this? Is it kind of old Van Morrison fans, or is it younger people who found you on YouTube? When you talk to people after a show, what's the spread like?
Oh, it's people who love the album, the original album. So obviously they are Van fans.
Van fans, nice.
Van fans. Oh, yeah, I've used that before. That's a good one. There'll be that, but there'll also be people coming along who are, maybe just want to see what it is you're doing now. I mean, I'm always doing something different as well, and a lot of the musicians on the stage are as well. So, everyone's invited. Come along.
Thank you, Orphy Robinson. We're looking forward to it, and that's November 19th here at the Southbank Centre.
Great, thank you very much.
You can see all the events that the Southbank Centre will be hosting for the London Jazz Festival and get tickets by going to southbankcentre.co.uk. Now, let's round things off with some recommendations. In an interview, I think last year, you said that you wanted the Jazz Festival to be a bit like the Proms. So Proms is seen as an entry point to classical music, and you want this festival to be seen as an entry point to jazz music, as well as your hordes of, already devoted audience members. So I'd love it if you could give us some recommendations for people who are wanting to go to the festival and aren't sure what events to start with. So if I were to go on a date over the month of November, which will hopefully happen, what event should I be going to?
I think you probably better start at the beginning. The Jazz Voice Gala that we do is Guy Barker and a 42-strong orchestra taking 8 different singers and asking them to sing their hit and a song that has a kind of meaning to them. So often it's a kind of classic jazz number. He arranges all of them. So 8 singers, 16 songs, and you'll never hear them again live the way you do then. That ends up being, it's kind of projected onto giant video screens. It's actually a curiously intimate experience for a very, very big concert. But that's something where it's almost like giving someone a box of sweets and inviting them to pick from them. It's an event that we're very proud to bring to the festival hall at the start of the festival.
So, successful date and one I could bring anyone to, because there's something
Yes.
for everyone. And then if it went well and we wanted to party together at a later date, where would we be heading next?
Well, I think if you want to party, the party I'd recommend is Booger Wesseltoft. He's one of those artists who sits inside dance and jazz, and he is this project is inspired by Esbjørn Svensson, who was one of the kind of great 21st century jazz composers, died tragically young, and his band is playing with Booger, not playing the music they used to play with Esbjørn, but almost music that's inspired and creating new work. It's a band called Rymden, and it's a fantastic first half, actually, with a British bass player called Liran Donin, who's created a piece about refugees called 1,000 Boats. That sense of refugees and exodus is another of those sort of ideas that lies under the surface of the jazz festival. And this band, 1,000 Boats, we saw playing in a club and really wanted to programme them on a big stage where they'd play to a lot more people.
Brilliant. And then if I wanted to really be at the cutting edge of something new, I used to get The Enemy every week and tick off all the bands that I knew and research the ones I didn't. So thinking about that kind of hardcore devotion to the cutting edge, where should I go?
So there's lots of things inside the Southbank programme that very few people have heard of apart from the devotees, and the festival, I think, does a lot of that in that it gets people to one audience and then they grow out from there. So the Italian pianist Remo Anzavino, who's playing in the Purcell Room, I'd recommend him. But I've got to recommend Camilla George and Sarah Tandy. I mean, I think they're just fantastic players. In a way, I'm sort of surprised it's taken so long for someone to say, we're putting on a main stage and let's really shine the spotlight.
Brilliant. And the last recommendation for people who were wooed at previous editions of the London Jazz Festival and who now have children as a result of that match, where should they go?
Again, we've created a special family show, which is part of the programme we're doing around Windrush. It's Cherise Adams Burnett is a young singer and kind of creator, composer, whose work we really loved, and we talked to her about what she would like to do. And she had the stories of her grandmother, who used to tell her the story of the yellow birds that would fly across the ocean to sort of represent the idea of their travel from the Caribbean to Britain. So she's created this show with a little band called Evelyn and the Yellow Birds, and that premieres on the first Saturday in the Purcell Room at 11 o'clock in the morning. And I'd say that's a must. If you want something that you can enjoy with young people, it's that, and then go on to some of the free stage activity, because the free stage activity is very inclusive. You can see as much as little as you want on the Claw Ballroom, and that's one of the things that's really special about the Southbank's presence, is it isn't just about the concerts you buy tickets for, but it's also about all the sort of things that flood the whole centre and join it all up and mean the bars are buzzing and mean that it's a really exciting place to come to.
That is a brilliant roundup. David, thank you very much for coming in, and good luck programming across 70 stages.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Think Aloud. We'll be back next time with a comedy special where my sparkling wit will be matched and then outmatched by award-winning comedian Dave Gorman, who'll be joining me in the studio. And we'll be answering a comedically themed burning question, which is, how do you make something not funny, funny?